There is a man whose name we will never know. For nearly 30 years, he lived completely alone in a small patch of forest in the Brazilian state of Rondônia, digging deep holes in the ground, some to trap animals, some, it's believed, simply to hide in when outsiders came near. He spoke no language anyone could identify. He built no relationships with the outside world because the outside world had already taken everything from him. His people are believed to have been wiped out by ranchers who wanted the land they were standing on. He was the last of them. In August of 2022, he was found dead in his hammock, apparently of natural causes. With him, an entire people, their language, their stories, their particular way of understanding the world vanished from the earth. We never learned what they called themselves. This is the Amazon most people never hear about. Not the jaguars or the rivers or the canopy stretching to the horizon. The people, because right now, today, in the year 2026, there are human beings living in the Amazon rainforest who have never had sustained contact with the rest of the human race. They have never seen a phone, never tasted refined sugar, never heard an engine that didn't terrify them. They are not relics of the past. They are not a memory of how humanity used to live. They are alive right now, making decisions, raising children, defending their homes in the same forest during the same year as everyone watching this video. According to the most comprehensive count ever assembled, published by the rights organization Survival International, there is robust evidence of 196 uncontacted peoples living across 10 countries in South America, Asia, and the Pacific. The overwhelming majority are in South America. Brazil alone is believed to be home to over 100 of these groups, more than anywhere else on the planet. Estimates suggest there may be as many as 10,000 uncontacted individuals across the world. Some are entire peoples who have never had contact with outsiders of any kind in living memory. Others are smaller bands who broke away from larger groups generations ago, fleeing violence, disease, or exploitation, and chose never to return. It's worth being precise about a word because it gets misused constantly. Uncontacted does not mean undiscovered, and it does not mean unaware. Every uncontacted group on Earth knows that an outside world exists. They have seen the planes overhead. They have found the machetes and the cooking pots left behind by neighboring villages. They are not lost, and they are not primitive remnants of an earlier age of humanity. They have made a choice, an active, ongoing, repeated choice to remain apart from a world that has historically given them every reason to fear it. To understand why, you have to go back roughly 140 years to the rubber boom. Beginning in the 1880s, the global demand for rubber sent prospectors pouring into the Amazon basin in numbers the region had never seen. What followed was one of the most brutal chapters in the history of South America. Indigenous people across the rainforest were enslaved, worked to death harvesting latex from rubber trees, flogged, hunted for sport, and murdered in numbers that are still difficult to comprehend. Entire peoples were nearly extinguished within a single generation. The ones who survived did so by doing one thing: disappearing. They fled upriver into the deepest, least accessible parts of the forest, and they simply stopped coming out. That single historical trauma, repeated across dozens of different tribes, in different countries, at different points in the 20th century, is the root of almost every uncontacted group that exists today. Their isolation isn't an accident of geography. It's a survival strategy, chosen deliberately and maintained for well over a century. Take the Mashco Piro, believed to be the largest uncontacted tribe on Earth, with a population estimated at more than 750 people living in the remote forests of southeastern Peru. Their ancestors were hunted, enslaved, and slaughtered by the private army of a rubber baron named Carlos Fitzgerald in the 1890s, a story so brutal it was later loosely dramatized by the filmmaker Werner Herzog. The survivors retreated into the headwaters of remote rivers and stayed there for more than a century. But Here is what makes the Mashco Piro story matter right now, today, rather than as a historical footnote. In the summer of 2024, dozens of Mashco Piro people began appearing on riverbanks near a small settlement called Monte Salvado in Peru's Madre de Dios region. Photographs published by Survival International showed more than 50 Mashco Piro men gathered in the open, an extraordinary, almost unprecedented sight for a people who have spent generations actively avoiding exactly this kind of visibility. Researchers estimated that, including the women and children who stayed hidden nearby, as many as 150 tribal members may have been in the immediate area. They were not coming out to make contact. They were coming out because they were being pushed. Logging concessions, some of them certified by international bodies as sustainably and ethically managed, had crept to within a few miles of where the Mashco Piro were photographed. One company alone had built more than 120 miles of road deep into territory the tribe depends on for hunting, fishing, and finding turtle eggs along the riverbanks each dry season. The Mashco Piro were not behaving erratically. They were doing what any of us would do if the walls of our home were being torn down around us. They were looking for somewhere left to stand. The consequences of that pressure have been exactly as devastating as advocates warned. In July of 2024, loggers were attacked near Mashco Piro territory. The following month, in August, at least 2 more loggers were killed and several others injured or reported missing in a confrontation along the Pariamanu River Basin. A regional indigenous rights organization representing dozens of local communities described the situation in stark terms: a matter of life and death worsening by the week, with the government doing almost nothing to stop it. It would be easy, hearing only that, to come away with the impression that the Mashco Piro are simply violent. That impression would be exactly backwards. In 2014, roughly 200 Mashco Piro armed with bows and arrows raided a nearby village, taking food and tools not out of aggression, but because the avenues for survival inside their own shrinking territory had narrowed so severely that raiding a neighbor's stockpile had become a viable option. Neighboring Yin villages, who share a related language and can sometimes understand fragments of Mashco Piro speech, have responded not with fear, but with quiet solidarity, deliberately planting extra gardens of bananas and yucca near the forest edge, specifically so the Mashco Piro have something to take without having to ask and without having to fight. It is one of the more remarkable acts of neighborliness happening anywhere on Earth right now, and almost nobody has heard of it. Move north across the border into Brazil and you find the Javari Valley, a vast protected territory roughly the size of Austria, and home to the highest concentration of uncontacted peoples anywhere in the world. Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency, FUNAI, has documented evidence of dozens of distinct uncontacted groups living inside this single region alone. Among them are the Carubo, sometimes called the Caceteiros or club wielders, for the heavy wooden weapons some bands still carry. In 1996, a group of around 30 Carubo made contact with Brazilian authorities. The rest of their people, their relatives by blood and by language, chose not to follow them out and remain isolated in the forest to this day, repeatedly avoiding contact even with their own contacted kin. There is another group in the Javari Valley known only by the name given to them by outsiders, the Flecheiros, the Arrow people, named for their habit of firing warning shots at anyone who approaches. In recent years, Brazilian officials investigating reports of a possible mass killing targeting the Flecheiros faced an agonizing dilemma. To investigate properly might have meant approaching the very people they were trying to protect, risking the introduction of diseases that have devastated isolated groups again and again throughout history. A common cold, harmless to the rest of us, can be a death sentence to an immune system that has never encountered it. This is the central, almost unbearable paradox of trying to help people who have explicitly chosen not to be found. Further east in the Brazilian state of Maranhão live the Awa, widely considered the most endangered uncontacted people in the Amazon. Several Awa bands continue to live as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving constantly through a forest reserve that has been carved down to a fraction of its original size. They live, by every account from researchers who study them from a distance, in a state of near constant flight, fleeing the sound of chainsaws in the dry season, fleeing the smoke of deliberately set wildfires, fleeing cattle ranchers who have settled illegally inside land that is supposed to be legally protected. Their entire forest world has been reduced to a shrinking island, surrounded on every side by roads, farms, and fire. What's happening to the Awa, the Mashkopiro, the Flecheros, and dozens of groups like them is not a single isolated problem. It's the same pressure applied from a dozen different directions at once. Survival International's most recent global assessment found that nearly 2/3 of uncontacted peoples worldwide face active threats from logging. Roughly 40% face pressure from mining. About 1 in 5 face encroachment from large-scale agriculture. Layered on top of all of that, in recent years, is an even newer threat: organized crime. Drug trafficking routes have increasingly pushed into the most remote stretches of the Amazon, precisely because those are the areas with the least government presence, which also happen to be exactly the areas where uncontacted peoples have spent generations hiding. There is a phrase that researchers and advocates working in this field have started using carefully, deliberately, because they believe it's the only phrase that fits: silent genocides. Not because anyone is necessarily standing over these communities with the explicit intention of erasing them, though in some documented historical cases, that has been exactly the intention. But because the outcome is the same, regardless of intention, no film crews, no breaking news alerts, a people who were here for thousands of years and then one logging road or one untreated illness later are simply gone. Brazil's government has, at times, attempted real protective action. There are now 5 legally designated reserves intended to protect isolated peoples, along with national policies that are, on paper, some of the strongest indigenous protections in the world. Peru has its own reserve system, but the gap between law and enforcement in both countries remains enormous. In Peru, a reserve created specifically to protect the Mashkopiro covers barely 1/3 of the territory that indigenous advocates originally requested, leaving the other 2/3 open to exactly the kind of commercial logging concessions that are now pushing the tribe towards starvation, displacement, and violent confrontation. And there is an uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this that deserves to be said plainly. Some of the wood being cut from inside protected indigenous territory does not stay in South America. It is sold internationally, sometimes carrying certification labels that are supposed to guarantee ethical and sustainable sourcing. Consumers thousands of miles away buying furniture or flooring with a label promising responsible forestry, maybe, without any way of knowing it, funding the exact pressure that is pushing an isolated people toward the edge of extinction. The chain connecting a logging road in the Peruvian Amazon to a showroom floor somewhere else in the world is longer than most of us imagine, but it is a connected chain all the same. None of this means these peoples are helpless or doomed or waiting passively for the modern world to finish them off. Every piece of evidence we have suggests the opposite. The Mashkopiro have survived 140 years since the rubber boom by being relentlessly, intelligently resistant. They monitor outsiders far more closely than outsiders monitor them. They retreat, they warn, and when warning fails, some bands have shown they are willing to fight. Indigenous rights organizations are explicit on this point. An uncontacted people's refusal of contact is not weakness or fear. It is a rational, informed response to more than a century of evidence that contact, virtually every single time it has happened, has brought disease, violence, and the loss of everything they have. International law, for what it's worth, is largely on their side. The United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have both formally recognized a right to self-isolation, the right of a people to simply say no, and to have that no respected permanently by every government and every commercial interest on earth. The legal principle is called free, prior, and informed consent. Since an uncontacted people cannot, by definition, give informed consent to a logging concession or a mining permit, the law is technically clear. No activity is permitted on their land at all. The principle is sound. The enforcement in the dense, ungoverned interior of the world's largest rainforest is something else entirely. So, what happens next? That, more than anything else, is the question hanging over every uncontacted people left in the Amazon today. Some advocates believe the next decade is the most dangerous in generations. That without dramatically stronger enforcement of existing protections, a significant fraction of the world's remaining uncontacted peoples could disappear within years, not centuries. Others point to small, hard-won victories, international pressure that has, on occasion, forced logging certifications to be suspended, forced companies to be investigated, forced governments to at least acknowledge what their own agencies already knew. The truth is probably both things at once. Genuinely fragile and genuinely still fighting. It can be tempting, looking at satellite photographs of the unbroken green canopy of the Amazon, to imagine it as empty wilderness, nature untouched by humanity, waiting to be explored or exploited depending on who's looking at the map. It has never been empty. For thousands of years, the Amazon has been someone's home. Right now, in 2026, it still is. Somewhere beneath that canopy, completely unaware that you are watching this, an uncontacted family is doing something achingly ordinary. Building a shelter, teaching a child to recognize a plant, listening for the particular birdsong of a tinamu that, to a yin ear nearby, might actually be a person signaling that they need help and would rather not have to ask for it out loud. The man who died alone in his hammock in Rondonia in 2022 spent nearly 30 years as the last surviving member of an entire people. He dug holes in the ground his whole life, possibly to hide from a world that had already taken everything else from him. We don't know what he called himself. We don't know what he called his people. What we do know is that somewhere in the vastness of the Amazon, there are still others like him, not yet alone, not yet the last of anything, who are choosing every single day to stay exactly where they are. The forest is still theirs. For now, the only thing any of us can really do is make sure it stays that way.